Hello, welcome to Feminist Founders. I am joined today by Terri Givens, who we met through Threads. I love Threads. It's like
Yes.
I'm meeting the most amazing people there. It's fantastic, and I'm really excited that you agreed to come on and chat with me. I love having these conversations with folks who are talking about important issues and finding ways to bring them to our audience who are obviously business owners and care about equity and social justice and want to be a part of making a better world, but sometimes the how feels harder than the passion and drive. So Terri, you're the author of Radical Empathy and Reckoning, which is out. Hold them up. There it is. Radical Empathy. That
Yes.
was 2021, and Reckoning, which is
Yes.
from 2025, but the paperback is coming
Yes.
out this year.
Yes.
And I think from what I understand, radical empathy is more of the why we need to use empathy and what that looks like and that sort of thing. But then reckoning is a little bit more to the brass tacks of like exactly how do we put all that into action. So between the two, it seems like a really great playbook for people. So thanks for being here.
Yes. My pleasure.
And I want to start obviously at radical empathy. And the phrase itself seems fairly clear to me. It's like unwavering empathy, like even in the face of things that are challenging, how do I find and understand, try to find those places of understanding with other humans? But tell me what I might be missing. If for somebody who's like, I'm not quite, I can kind of feel radical empathy. I think I get it, but how's that different than just empathy?
Well, I thought a lot about this, and this book comes out of my own personal experiences. So I would also say that radical empathy is part memoir. And as I was thinking through what was going on in the world, especially, around 2019 and so on, I realized that, okay, I can have empathy, but if I don't take action, it just doesn't mean anything. So I realized that we had to take another step. And I decided that I was in the process of kind of doing some really deep dives into my own positionality and how I wanted to, move forward in the world. And I realized that, I've always been a person of action. So I believe that by combining empathy with action, that's how you get radical empathy. And so to me, that radical, it's funny because some people I think, oh, radical, I'm not a radical. It's not about that. It's about, I have the 6 steps to radical empathy, which is the first is being vulnerable. So it's a very personal internal journey at the start and saying, because I realize that so many of us have bias and we don't acknowledge it because we're ashamed or, you can think of Brene Brown's work. But the interesting thing to me is that once I started taking that internal deep dive, it's very freeing because you say, wait a second. Yes, I am a human being. I have bias. I have to work at it. And I really think that's the critical point. So it's the first step is being vulnerable. The second step is being open to the experiences of others. Especially as women and as business owners, we experience this all this time. Why are you starting a business? Things like that. And the reality is we have to be open to those kinds of experiences, and say, instead of saying, why are you doing this? Say, oh, that's really interesting. I want to hear more about what you're doing and things like that. So being open to other people's experiences and understanding that your worldview is not the end all be all. And then the next step is, basically, you know, actually, sorry, I missed a step because the first 2 steps are being vulnerable. The second step is really getting to know who you are, being grounded in who you are, and then being open to the experiences of others. Then the most important step is practicing empathy, but also taking action. So steps 4 and 5, practicing empathy, taking action. And we have to practice empathy every day. I don't just because I wrote a book called Radical Empathy doesn't mean I'm always good about having empathy. I can look at the latest, World Cup game. I was really rooting for England, but I'm going to try to have empathy for those Argentinian fans who are now happy.
You're doing
And then
better than I am
finally,
around that one.
well, let's not get into that then. But yeah, so practicing empathy, taking action, and then the final step is creating change and building trust. Right. So those things are something anybody can do.
Well, let's start at the beginning that then, because when you talk about the internal part first, and I think it's great when we do
Hmm.
work that starts here and then works outward, you talk about internalized oppression. And I think one of the things that can happen is, and I can only take my lived experience. So one area of oppression is as a woman and just those things that, being socialized as a woman and all of the issues that can come up around that. And it's easy for me to quickly go to men shouldn't be this way, men need to change, the systems that harm me need to change. But and I did that for a long time until I got to the place of doing the work of understanding I have taken on some of these beliefs and how are they showing up and how I am interacting with other women. The judgment that I would have, the feelings I would have about other women, the things I would say, the ways, the expectations I would place on other women. And doing that work is it's so overlooked, I think, because it's way
Mhm,
harder. It's a lot
mhm,
easier to just point finger than it is to
mhm.
have to say, where am I taking this on? So when you talk about that internalized oppression, how did you start to do that work? And how do you suggest for others to do it? Because it can be really hard to go there and to to
Yes.
even unearth it.
Yeah. No, it's extremely difficult at times because, you know, where I saw it was in my own family, right? And the fact that, I kind of didn't understand why my parents had decided. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, right? My mom is from Louisiana. My dad is from Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. And, my dad was in the military and we landed in Spokane, Washington. And Spokane, especially in 1964, when I was born, is a place that is less than 1% black. And, we were fine growing up. And so, I mean, I get into all that, but the area where I wanted to really dive in was understanding my parents and the choices they made and how that then impacted me. And I have to give a shout out to Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, because that book was life changing for me in so many different ways. But it gave me a better understanding of their motivations, but also they were in many ways anti-black because they would didn't want us to hang out with a lot of other black kids, and it was a class issue, right? And not that we were wealthy or anything, we were very much lower middle class. I'm the youngest of 7, so there was a lot of us. I was raised Catholic. Sometimes I say I should write another memoir that talks about growing up black and Catholic in Spokane, Washington. But I realized that I had internalized this bias and that I often felt uncomfortable around other black people. And it took a while for me to really dive in and say, okay, where is this coming from? Why do you have these feelings? And then how do I address them in a way? And I call my 20s my years of cognitive dissonance because people try to put you in a box. They see a black woman in front of them and they say, oh, well, you must be X, Y, and Z. Well, you talk a certain way, you act a certain way, you like a certain kind of music, and all these different things. And so I had to really work past that. And so I'd already done a lot of the work. It's just it was going back and acknowledging what that work was about. And by the time I got to late 20s, I feel like I was much more accepting of myself. So that's why say you have to be grounded in who you are, because you have to accept, okay, I accept that this is the way I was raised. But that doesn't mean I have to live my life the rest of my life that way. I can change that. I can say, I am going to recognize it, acknowledge it, and then move on and do better, right? It's so important that we, think about how do we change those patterns? How do we try to be better? And that's on the individual.
Yeah. So important. And thank you for sharing some of your personal journey in that, because I think if you can get quiet and really ask yourself those questions, like, where did I think and I'd love to hear what questions maybe help you in that journey. But I think things like, where did I learn this? Who benefits from me thinking this way? Those can be some of the things that help to unpack some of that. But were there other things like that that were helpful for you or that people might use to do some of that work of excavating some of that internalized oppression?
Well, yeah, being the youngest of 7, I have all these siblings. I have 4 sisters, 2 brothers. So I actually did talk a lot with my siblings, partly because they're older than me and they were around when all of this, history for me was happening. And also to kind of get their perspective on, the decisions that were made growing up and so on. But I've had mentors, throughout my life. And uh, I, really appreciate the friends and the colleagues who have been able to have these conversations with me that help me to I have one friend in particular who had a similar family and so on, and we had long conversations about what it was like growing up black, young, and in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and kind of the different influences and how our parents chose to raise us and things like that. So I think, yeah, there were lots of friends who I reached out to in the process of working through these ideas, and social media was yet another place. I have especially with my book Reckoning, I have a friend Greg Sattel who we would have conversations about related to how you create change and so on. So there have been lots of folks along the way, but at some point we should come back to this issue of mentoring because I think it's an important one.
Yeah, especially in the business space, I think it's really valuable. Well, before we do then, because one of the next parts of that journey, you talk about vulnerability, which for a lot of people is deeply challenging, particularly in workspaces where I think, again, going back to some of our certainly around gender, but probably there's also race dynamics in here where we are very conditioned to check our feelings at the door and that we have to show up very stoic and not let things bother us, right? We don't want to let them see us sweat, all of that. And, women are particularly, I think, conditioned around not being perceived as emotional in the workspace. So
Hmm.
when you talk about vulnerability, I think that can scare people. And obviously, vulnerability does not have to mean crying. It does not have to mean all of those things. It means being really honest. But there's also the fear of how will that be received? Am I safe to do that? So what do you say to people, and especially for people who are creating safe or safer spaces for vulnerability in the workspace? How do you actually do that when you know people are coming into the room with all that armor on in the work setting?
Yeah, and I think there are people for who can't be vulnerable, right? And but depending on how you define it. So one of the things I say, first of all, is it's not I'm not asking you to be vulnerable with everybody. It's being vulnerable, first of all, with yourself. And that's the most important component of vulnerability, is being vulnerable with yourself first. And then, you have to gauge how does vulnerability work into my day-to-day or interactions with people. So there are some people, yes, you can be vulnerable with. It could be a friend or colleague, somebody you work with who you have that level of comfort. But if you're like talking to a group of employees, the thing is you have to be very careful about how you're vulnerable, right? And so you don't want to just spew everything, right? You can go overboard with vulnerability. So that's why I think really focus in on being vulnerable with yourself, and that then guides you in how to have those interactions. So one reason why I think vulnerability is important in the workplace is that we are often afraid to admit mistakes. And there's so many different, and I talk about this in the book. So there's lots of different folks who have talked about the importance of being able to admit mistakes and then correct them, right? Because I think one of the biggest frustrations for me when I'm working with people is when they won't admit a mistake, and so you can't fix it. And so it's really important that we are able to fix things in a way that allows us to move forward. And I think a lot of times in business, we keep going down the same path, and we don't try to admit that we made a mistake or that we need to fix something. And so sometimes that's where vulnerability comes in. So it's not necessarily personal vulnerability. It's not saying, oh, I had a horrible day. It's more like, oh, we need to do something different here. We need to admit that this isn't working.
Yeah. And while we're at this place of vulnerability and safety, something that I've been coming to lately, and I'm very curious just to get your feedback or your take on this, since you talk a lot about creating safer spaces, brave spaces, whatever we want to call them, is that I am getting to a place of where I feel like, as somebody who creates a lot of community spaces, that as a white woman, I don't think I can even aspire to creating a safe space for Black women. That my goal is just to create safer spaces. And I think
Hmm.
for me, that removing of some ideal that I have to get to this place of creating safety and understanding that I probably can't create safety for people, and not just Black women, a lot of other folks who have different identities than I hold, that actually feels really good in releasing myself from that as a goal, because that's like it sort of feels like the white supremacist ideals around perfectionism and how those can feel they're so restraining in a way, and I think by design, right, to keep us from even taking action. So just I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I feel like I have had some conversations about this recently with some students who felt they needed a safe this has been a debate in higher education. How do you create safe spaces for students? And you cannot create a perfectly safe space, right? People are people. And even somebody you feel very close to might say something hurtful, either unknowingly or for whatever reason. So no, it's so we can create, I prefer to say brave spaces where people feel comfortable saying what they want to say. And, and this is only something I've really been thinking deeply about in the last few months as we've seen these terrible things happening in the world. And, I've had a student ask me, well, I need a safe space. I'm like, well, what does that mean to you to have a safe space? And, does it mean we have police patrolling, or we somehow, are doing some, I mean, you don't want that either. So we have to think more, I think, in terms of brave spaces where people feel comfortable talking about what they are concerned about. And, I also think in different ways about how can we create access for people to share things anonymously, or how do we create situations where people who feel safe with each other can come together and have those conversations. So it's really very dependent on the situation. And so I think we have to be very conscious of what we're talking about when we mean a safe space. And I really appreciate your approach to it, because it's hard to create a space where everybody is going to feel comfortable. But I don't think it's as hard to create a space where, people who feel comfortable can be brave and speak up. And then that actually can create a braver space, because I talk about this, bystander effect. If somebody is willing to speak up and you see that they do not get jumped all over, then you're going to be more likely to speak up. So that's the kind of space I think we can create.
Well, my business partner and feminist founders, Faith Clark, who couldn't be here because she's relocated back to Jamaica and she's very deep in her move at the moment. I'm sure she would have loved to have had this conversation, but she talks a lot about the co-creation of agreements in spaces, and that, as you're saying, they're so dependent, right? So each new space, the community, what it really looks like to create, because she talks a lot about belonging. To create belonging is everyone in this particular room in this moment. Let's come to an agreement of what are we needing in this moment to create that feeling of safety or feeling safer or whatever it is. And like, what's our goal here? Right.
Hmm.
Because
Right.
the goal to say, like, we're all going to get naked in this room, that's a very different level of needing to create safety and agreements than to say, we're all going to share like our concerns about the future of this company. Those are two different situations, right? And require very different levels of safety. So it's that agreement amongst the people in the room to co-create that. Because like you said, for a group of white women, police in the room might feel real safe. For a group of black women or black men, that might feel very different. So I love that. And that's also where I think that empathy comes in, right? In that
Hmm.
understanding of that.
That's
So
right.
for me in this room, a bunch of police officers might make me feel safe. Why is it that for Terry, maybe that isn't the case? Like that questioning, the curiosity.
Right. Well, so it wouldn't be feel safe for me, because those police are looking at me and differently than they're looking at you. Right. So this is the problem, is and I've actually worked with the police, and here I'm sitting in Menlo Park, California right now. And I've worked with the
I
police
saw an
here.
interview you
And
did about that, and you even said we have to remember police are people too. And I was like, oh, that's
yes,
interesting. Because yeah, the ACAB thing
yes,
can get real easy to sort of be like, no. So yeah,
yes, they are. But, we also know that police tend to, see people, they classify people by race. We have, we can document over and over and over again. And so I have to be extra careful, and my boys have to be extra careful that we don't do anything that's going to cause them to, pull out their weapon, things like that. So there's this basic problem that of racial profiling, and but there's also, the distrust that has developed. And that's one of the things I tried to focus on when I was working with the police, is how do we build trust in this kind of an environment? And a lot of it has to do with relationship, right? And so if, we talk a lot about community policing, and I know there are folks out there who think we just need to abolish the police. That's didn't go very far, and however you feel about it. But we do have to humanize each other and make sure that the people we are putting in those positions are people who are thoughtful and can humanize people. And their first instinct isn't to just grab a weapon when they see somebody who looks different than they do. And it's not just for black people. It's we're seeing all kinds of groups that are, excuse me, being profiled in different ways. And so, living up in Canada part time, I see huge problems for the Asian community there. And so we have to remember that this is a broader issue, and that it's something that we all need to be thinking about in ways that allow us to say we need to reform the police in a way that they are serving the entire community, not just one part of the community.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in the age of face, and you write a lot about immigration, there's a whole space there as well. And it brings me to something I really wanted to get to as well, because when we talk about empathy, and part of what you said is like, it's that, can I bridge gaps? Can I find relationship? Can I try to find understanding with others? And I think a lot of people think that's well and good. And yes, I think of myself as an empathetic person. How, though, do you deal with when you are dealing with people? And this can happen in a workplace. This can happen when you are a business owner and, making decisions about vendors you're going to use or collaborations you're going to have or clients you will or won't work with. How do you bring that when it comes to somebody whose beliefs are not only opposed to yours, because that, we can disagree about which is the best topping of for pizza. That's one
Mhm.
thing. But when it's your beliefs are questioning my right to exist or about taking away my rights or the rights of people I love, those sorts of things. How do you bring empathy into those situations?
So the first step is something I really have leaned into because, and again, I give credit to my friend Greg Sattel for this: is empathy is not absolution. And just because we have empathy, and actually, it's interesting because you know you can use empathy as a tool to actually even figure out who are the people I want to interact with versus not. So I call it strategic empathy. And if I put myself in the position of this person and, think about how they should be interacting with me, and I don't like the way they're interacting with me, then I can say, no, I don't want to work with these people. Or I can, figure out how can I work with this person in a way that is, allows me to maintain my integrity. And so there are a lot of people who I have just said, no, I can't work with you. And unless you are willing to, change the way you're acting or your beliefs, then that just does not work for me. And, even in families, this can happen. And so
A
I do
lot.
think a lot, yes. So I think our integrity is important, but also you do not want to reify bad behavior. So you don't want to say, oh, well, I'm just going to work with this person anyway. Just, no, that's not. So we do have to have some judgment here. And actually, by having empathy and saying, okay, well, let me try to figure out where is this person coming from? They've been getting a lot of misinformation or disinformation. They've been watching Fox News too much, whatever it may be. And okay, so now I can see where that person is coming from, but I still don't want to work with that person. Now, there may be situations where you have to work with somebody like that. And that's where you have to, unfortunately, sometimes just say, okay, I have to do this, but it's not our ongoing way of doing things. And so I think part of the problem, and I see this too often, is like, oh, well, we have to work with these people, even though, yes, I was going to say, like in the Democratic Party, it's like, oh, well, we have to have bipartisanship. It's like, no, not always, especially if things are happening that are harmful. We don't want to cause more harm. And that's kind of what it boils down to is, is this going to cause more harm? And so, and trust me, it's complicated. It's difficult at times. Relationships are difficult. And so again, I don't want to pretend like I have some magic bullet for how we deal with these things. It's hard for me too. That's all I can
Yeah.
say.
I think when people hear the term, forget people, me. When I hear the term radical empathy, I think it sounds like this aspirational, and maybe it's the word radical, right? That makes us feel like it's this
Hmm.
aspirational level of empathy where it means I have to find empathy for all people. And it sounds like you can try. And also that doesn't necessarily have to change your ultimate decisions about whether you engage with these people. But does that
That's
also
right.
then for you affect, because you mentioned, like, using Argentina as a small example, like the World Cup, I don't wanna go too deep either into that either, but, like, where it's really easy to not to then say, "Okay, maybe I disagree with how things happened, behaviors, whatever," but also maybe the empathy is, "But I know they're really trying hard to win, and the things we do for that." Can I then is part of what the radical empathy is in those places of disagreement, or the people where you say, I for my own integrity, my own health, I have to end this relationship here. Is it then also about the part about vilifying? To not take that additional step?
Hmm.
Because that's what we see so much of right now in this really divisive
Yes.
space. And listen, I'm as guilty as the next person, so I'm not high and mighty here at all. I know that it's
Hmm.
easy for me sometimes to just get a little, like, flippant and rude and whatever. That's the part, though, that I think is maybe what you're talking to is like, can we stop at the part where we say, I just don't have to have you in my life, period.
Mhm. Yes. That to me is important, and I've even you're making me think about kind of my own interactions around this, and basically, I will say, "Well, I want England to beat Argentina." Well, they didn't. Okay, well, I'm gonna watch the game on Saturday, and we'll see if I decide to watch the game on Sunday. So there's ways to do things without raising the temperature. Trust me, I've been to Argentina. I've studied some of the history. It's a lot of it's very ugly, unfortunately, but so is the history of the U.S. and so is the history in England. So, I mean, I worry that we're putting things out of context, and oftentimes in these situations, and that's another thing I think that we have to consider is that context matters. So I talk about mental health and my mother and the struggles we had with her, and, it would be very easy for me to vilify my mother and say, she was abusive and things like that. But on the other hand, I can have some compassion for her by understanding that she grew up during in Louisiana during the Jim Crow era, that she was born in 1930. You had the Depression, Jim Crow, World War II, all these things, that she had to live through. And I can have some compassion for her, right? And say, oh, well, she was this way because of what she experienced in her life, and, it doesn't mean I like what she did, but it means that I'm willing to step back and say there were reasons behind that,
That's that
and
empathy, not
so
absolution.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. And you don't have to go to the extra step of then necessarily vilifying her. It can just be that.
Exactly.
A lot of
Yeah.
this is easier said than done, but this is why we need the book, right?
Yes.
To keep reading it and
That's
remind
right.
ourselves. Well, let's move into the
Yes.
last part of what I want to talk about, which is probably the meat of things, which is really where I think you're coming at now with Reckoning, which is around action. Because I've watched several interviews with you in preparation for this, and you talk a lot about how you think that both empathy and leadership are not just skills, it's not just feelings, it's not like a state of being, but these are about their actions, they're a practice. And
Mhm.
so it's not just that you show up saying you're a leader or you show up saying you have empathy, it's we have to see it in action. But often it feels a little nebulous. Like, what does it
Mhm.
actually look like? And I know one of the things you talk about is safer spaces. We've covered that quite well, I think. But what are some of the other things that, as business owners in particular, that are like the actions we should be thinking about where we really can examine, am I bringing empathy? Am I bringing that form of empathetic leadership into these situations?
Right, and it crosses a pot. It goes across different aspects of being a leader, because there's the part of it. So I'll come at it as a business person myself. I'm always very entrepreneurial, even though I have a job as a professor. I'm always got something going, and I left academia for 3 years to run my own business. And one of the things that I found, both as somebody who has been managed and somebody who manages people, is to be very attuned to what the needs are of the people who are working for you. And so that's where empathy comes in. So I need to understand, how do I need to create a functional workplace, especially I was, pre-COVID, I was doing things remotely. And so in this remote situation, how do I interact with these people on a regular basis? And I'm doing this right now. I'm working with 5 RAs this summer, and I have to make sure that I'm checking in, that I'm giving them different opportunities to interact with me. We created a WhatsApp group so that they can contact me anytime, and I don't have to respond right away, but they know they can get in touch with me and not struggle through something and feel like they're spinning their wheels. So there's different ways to approach the workspace. There's different ways to approach how you recruit people. And actually, I spend a lot of time with my consulting clients talking about how are you recruiting people into these positions? And are you reaching out beyond the normal, here's my friends list and I'm going to, hire one of my friends, or I'm going to hire somebody who went to school with me, or, and I've been in situations where this is how people were doing their hires, and you have to expand beyond what you're comfortable with. So part of it is getting outside of your comfort zone. So much of this whole thing around radical empathy, with the vulnerability, with the, being open to the experiences of others, is being willing to get outside your comfort zone and say, well, instead of just talking to this group of people, I'm going to reach out to this group of people and say, hey, I'm looking for somebody who can do X, Y, and Z. It's I did this when I went to McGill. So I first started working in Canada 5 years ago at McGill University, and they asked me to come in and help them with their program. They were doing the strategy to address anti-Black racism, which meant hiring. Part of it was hiring more Black faculty. And I said, okay, I would talk to a department chair and say, okay, when you go to your annual meeting, political scientists, sociologists, we all have our annual meetings. Who are you talking to when you go to those meetings? And but then again, you have to be careful. Don't just grab a Black person and say, "Hey, we have a job." you know?
Well, before you go further, can I just interject really quickly? Because that's
Sure, please.
with the white privilege perspective, I think, and what I hear often inside of rooms where there's white folks who care deeply, right? These are people who really care. Like these same people I think you're talking about. Like, we want to see more diversity on our campus or in our office or in our offices, or like I also run the podcast collective. I want more diverse people on my show. And then when you talk to them about where they're getting guests or where they're fired, it's like, who's coming to me? And they'll say like, well, they don't come to me. Right. And it's like, well, you need to go out and reach out to more folks. Right.
Which
But
is
the thing that
exactly what you did.
well, right. What I hear people saying, and this used to be I get it. Here's my empathy. I get it because I used to, in the beginning of my journey, have a similar feeling of I don't want to engage in tokenism. I don't want to seem performative, right? And I had to get some of the comfort zone. I had to get outside of that fear and just say, if I'm truly committed to this, then my actions have to reflect it. But what do you like? What do you say for people? Because I know I can hear my old version of myself and people I still hear from with that feeling of like, oh, but I don't want to just be engaging in tokenism and I don't want to come off as performative or whatever. What do you say to folks like that when they're
Yeah,
feeling
well, I think part of it is not just grabbing that first Black person you see. Part of it is, like I said, building relationships. So instead of, when you go to your annual meeting, just grabbing random people, you go to somebody who's a well-known scholar who, like, I always direct people when they ask me, oh, how do I hire more Black grad students or whatever. I know who in the field who the people are who are working with Black students. And so I say, talk to this person, talk to this person. And we start to so you have to create networks. And networking is so critical and through all of this. And I'm excited to join your network and start reaching out to beyond even my own networks of people who are a lot of ours are in higher ed or in education. But I'm also an entrepreneur, and I'm very unusual in higher ed in that I do reach out. I've worked a lot with people in the ed tech sector and things like that. So part of it is getting outside your normal networks and starting to reach out and talk, have those have conversations first. Don't just jump in and say, "Oh, we have a job opening." It's like, no, hey, I haven't seen you before at this conference. Where you look at their name tag and see where they from and what's your research on, and have a conversation before you just jump in. And I mean, I have so many stories of when I was a grad student and just starting out as a professor. Of people just making assumptions based on what I look like, and not just white people, Black people too. And so we have to be careful, ask questions, right? Be curious. This is how you get to know people, but and not just jump into tokenism.
Yeah, and part of my feeling is like it's weird when you make it weird. Like if you're genuinely interested in meeting people and having real relationship with other humans, it's only weird if you make it weird. If and like you said, just showing up and being like, hey, come get this job, apply for it. I don't know a thing about you, but like, come apply. That's just weird whether the person was white, Black, whatever, tall, short. It doesn't like it's just that's
Hmm.
weird. So
Hmm.
just show up like a human
Hmm.
and engage like you would in relationship, but be intentional. Like we have to be really intentional and strategic. Not in, that makes it sound intentionality. I think is the key. It's being intentional in who we're reaching out to, and I just think that's so valuable. So thank you for bringing that up.
It all ties into what I was saying, which is that I end up advising a lot of folks around this whole issue of how you hire and how you pull people into creating a sense of belonging. And this is a really hard one because I have had experiences in higher ed where I felt like I was kind of marginalized, or it's hard when you're coming into an environment where people have been working together for a long time, or people are feeling like you're the new kid on the block and they don't know how to interact with you and things like that. And so that's why I'm so glad you mentioned the word intentionality, because we do have to be, when I was working at McGill with this whole, hiring Black faculty, it wasn't just hiring them. And actually, I always tell people the retention process starts even before you hire the person. How are you structuring things so that this person feels welcome, that they belong, that they have the opportunity to, get ahead, all these different things. Call it the platinum rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but go beyond that. Do unto others as they want done unto them. And you have to find out how they want to be dealt with. You have to ask questions. You have to, what's going to make you feel more comfortable in this workspace? How can we, do you need me to, and sometimes even when they tell you that, first of all, they may not know. I've run into that. Second, they may not understand exactly what they need. So it's really hard sometimes to find that happy medium of, this is what I need, but actually, no, I need to. So experience, right, is important, and not assuming, okay, I did this and I'm done. It's like, no, it's an ongoing thing of saying, we tried this, it didn't work. So how can we fix it? Again, it's iterations and intentionality, and saying, I'm not just gonna do this and then stop. It's a constant process, especially with this new generation of young people coming into the workforce. They're used to things being much more malleable, so we have to find ways to work with them. And I'm dealing with this in the classroom. So it's something that we have to be willing to. I really changed the way I teach over the last few years because of what I'm seeing amongst, even with my own kids. I have a 22-year-old and a 25-year-old, and they help really inform my approach to how I create space for my students.
Yeah, and to be clear, empathy goes beyond talking around issues of race. It's also around issues of age in the workspace and ability and so many things. And it's about that curiosity, like you said, because going back to the police reference, if I make assumptions about what makes you feel a sense of belonging in the workspace, then without that lived experience, I may then create a space where actually does the exact opposite of what my intention was because I didn't get curious. I didn't and empathy to me, curiosity is such a key component. I'm assuming you probably feel the same
Yes.
way, right? Because
Oh, 100%.
right, because how can I begin to understand your experience if I don't ask about it, right? If it's different than
Mhm.
my own, I have to ask about it to understand it. Okay, the last thing, because I wouldn't want to keep you all day. But you talk a lot about history as well. I'm really excited because I ordered your book that's about the history of the roots of racism in America. I can't wait to read that. And you talk about learning from history, which I mean, we are in a critical point in American US history. I think where learning about history is really important to understand where we're at and where the different paths things can go on. It can also be overwhelming and depressing to be in the current moment or to even look at the history because we know there is a path that could be really not great. I heard you reference Octavia Butler in an interview, and I love the fact that her work helps us see that there are
Future.
multiple. Yeah, right? There's a future that
Mhm.
doesn't it when we look collectively, when we work collectively and think collectively, it can look very different. But
Mhm.
when you look back on history, and some of these key points of change and inflection, especially more recent history in like the industrial age, what role do you see business being able to play in creating the future we want? Because I think so many of us think about these things. We go to the marches, we do the protests, we think about these things in our personal lives, but then we step into our office as a business owner and aren't always thinking about how can I use this business as a tool for the change I want to see in the world? Not just my personal life and those actions, but my business as a tool. So I'm just wondering if there's something to be learned from history about what business can do to help be a part of
Yeah.
change.
100%. Yeah, business, it's funny because we tend to think of business in chunks. There's the big conglomerates and then there's the small business, but there's everything in between. And we all have a role to play. I'm actually in the process of starting a nonprofit because one of the things I'm really passionate about is youth sports and college access. And things are changing dramatically on all these fronts. And if you've been here, everybody's talking about the whole youth soccer thing and how the US is not set up the way Europe is and all of this, and so, and I've been thinking about this for a long time because I worked for many years with college access programs, but I bring this up because I'm starting a business that is going to help deal with that issue by educating young people and parents, catching them in 7th grade and, before they get to high school and helping them understand what the changes are so that they can actually do what they need to do in high school to get to college, not maybe not focus, solely on sports, but how the importance of academics. So there's there's a direct impact that a business can have, whether it's a nonprofit, for profit, whatever. But I think business people have to look at the way, it's funny because actually I think business plays a huge role right now when we're seeing the federal government abandoning its support for women and the LGBTQ plus community and just about everybody except white men, right? And so where business can step in and say, well, I'm a private business. I can hire women. I can hire people of color. I can get a visa for this person, whatever. And there's all these different ways that business and historically has stepped up. And there's story after story of a business that said, no, we're going to, integrate our workspace. We're going to hire women. We're going to give education to those who we think have potential. All these different things that businesses can do. It's about having having your values show up in the way you conduct business. And it doesn't mean that we're each individual is responsible for changing the world. Each individual is responsible for their own little area. And actually, I believe it was Timothy Snyder who had posted on social media the other day that, it's what you do in your little space ripples out into the rest of the world. And the way you function in the world is going to be a model because we know, I mean, I have tons and tons of data in both of these books about how businesses that support women that are diverse do so much better, financially. And so there's just the basic economic reasons for doing it, as well as the values-based reasons for doing it. And there are lots of, one of my favorite businesses out there is Penzi Spice because they have all of these, they're constantly out there, talking about social justice and all these different things. And so I purposely go to Penzi Spice to get my spices because I really appreciate how they're out there, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. So, there's lots of examples of businesses, and I trust me, they have several chapters in my book Reckoning where I talk about how businesses, can create change.
Yeah, so definitely get the book. The paperback's coming out soon, but the hardback, is that what we call them? I guess so.
Yes,
And the Kindle and ebook are already available. And I saw that you have it's like 50% off if you order it. So
it
go to your
is.
website. I'll put the link in. I got 50% off the books I ordered today. I was very excited about that. I mean, who doesn't love a deal?
Yes,
Although I hope you still get paid okay for
I
those.
do.
But
Don't
yeah,
worry.
good to go. So
Yes,
check those out. Thank you so much for this. For the people who are listening, most especially those folks who are like, I'm a business of one. I'm not doing hiring. Don't forget you're still hiring vendors, you're still hiring clients. Like, clients is a two-way street, but or who are thinking like, it's a small little, what can I do? Just what do you wanna leave them with when you think about radical empathy and action? What do you want those people to be thinking about this weekend or maybe doing in the weeks ahead?
so each chapter of both of these books has actions you can take, but I would say this weekend, when you're interacting with people, like, one of the easiest ways for me to practice empathy, I travel a lot, so I'll get on the plane and I'll just say thank you to the flight attendants because I know their job is can be really crappy, or if I do get frustrated, I try to, take a step back, or if I'm standing in a long line, you know, what if people always tell me they notice I always have this sense of calm about me, and it's like, it's because I think about if I was a person, who has to talk to the person who's been on hold for an hour, or I have to, and it's not, it's not their fault that, the person you are talking to generally is not the one who created the awful conditions, right? So try to have some empathy for people you see, especially if you are in a frustrating situation and you want to lash out, just take a step back and think about why is this situation happening and who is really responsible, and maybe I shouldn't lash out at this person in front of me because it's not their fault.
Yeah, and I think love what you said earlier too of like, how do I wanna act in integrity in this moment? Like, I'm gonna really try to sit with that, most especially on social media, because that's where it's really easy for us keyboard warriors with our anonymity almost to be like, "Oh, you're a so and so." And it's like, is that really how I wanna show up in my integrity? So, thank you for that, Terry. Thank you for this conversation. Everybody make sure you check out your books. The 2 I think that are most applicable here are Radical Empathy and Reckoning, and I will definitely link to them in the show notes, the description everywhere. So you can go and find them. And again, they're 50% off right now. So you might as well grab them, right? Thank you, Terry. I really
Yes.
appreciate you.
Yes, thank you. This is really fun.